Welcome to this week's What's the Tea, a conversation series about relevant topics in our community. For Press House staff, me, Otto Abrahams, Becca Bedell, Erica Liu, and myself, Ginger Morgan, sit down for 30 unscripted minutes to discuss current events, social and political issues, and more. Not as experts, but as human beings dedicated to dialogue. So today, our topic is only blank people can talk. But before we get going, let's check in and see what kind of tea everybody's drinking. I'll start. I have a very nice turtle mug today, inside of which is iced decaf chai.
I meant to make myself a cup of tea, but I lost track of time. And so I am with water again today.
I'm right there with you, drinking water out of my bestickered water bottle here at the office. Black Lives Matter, shout out to the crossing, shout out to my favorite local band, Line, just collecting stickers on it.
And I just finished my last sip of some sort of coffee. I just went to Mocha, like right next to Press House, because I had to run into the office and get something. And I bought a bag of coffee and they gave me a small coffee. I have no clue what the roast is, but it smells like maple syrup. So I'm okay with it.
Well, since our last conversation, there has been news in the headlines about, in particular, Jessica Krug and CV Vitolo-Haddad from Madison, revealing that they had publicly adopted racial identities that had not been theirs. And that led us down an interesting set of questions about whether or not holding a particular identity gives you authority to speak on topics related to that identity. And other questions, maybe broader questions about who gets to speak and who is silenced in different ways. So that led us to our question, do only blank people get to talk? So with no further ado, I'm curious to hear people's thoughts about speech and identity and representation and how we hear people based on the identities that we perceive.
Well, if I may, this will kind of get us, I guess, into the topic by way of a story. So if you will, travel back with me to 4th grade in Carl Junction, Missouri. And I don't know what class we were in, but I remember we were watching some sort of like history video. And at some point in the video, they were talking about the era of Jim Crow and like segregation and lynching. And there was like in the video, some sort of depiction, maybe like a picture or a drawing or something of someone being lynched. And I remember as a kid being like, that is very scary, and like not fully understanding why I was scared, but just like, I mean, for any kid, that's a really, really horrifying picture to see. But then also remember everyone in the class like staring at me in that way that 4th graders like haven't quite learned how to do that secretly. So it was like very obvious they were all looking at me, like waiting for me to like say something or react or something like that. And I remember in that moment being like, why do you all think I have something to say? Because one, I had never seen anything like that before. And two, and this is specific to my sort of childhood and experience, like my parents are African immigrants. And so the story that we were like watching on the screen was not a story that I grew up hearing as my own. And so I was like, you all know more about this than I do. This is your country, it's not mine. And that was the first time I remember feeling that tension of like, there are certain subjects where like, if you're the Black kid in the room, everyone expects you to talk and they're just gonna like stare at you and watch. But also myself feeling like, just because I am Black doesn't mean I have anything to say about this particular issue. What I will say is that particular moment is also complicated for a number of reasons, but like that's where my mind went initially with this question.
I guess I thought about what prompts white people maybe to adopt a racial identity that isn't theirs, but even more to the point and maybe more revealing, my own expectation as a woman that when I see in particular white men, but really any men, talking about things about women or making decisions about women, like in public space, like Congress and the Senate and judicial confirmations, and pronouncing things, I guess, it is so irritating to me. And so I know there's something true for me about experience matters and how you represent, what claims you make, I guess. So it doesn't bother me if men are curious or men are supportive or men acknowledge that women in their lives have revealed things that have informed the way they think. But I'm very suspicious about men who just think they know better.
Yeah, it's super, super interesting to hear, Nee, your story and thinking about the cases of, I guess, what some folks are calling academic blackface that prompted us originally arriving at this topic. Because my initial reaction to the question of can only blank people talk is, yeah, sort of. Like, pretty much when it's an issue that is directly tied to a particular lived experience around a particular identity. To a large extent, I feel like you only have a truly informed opinion on those issues if you have that personal lived experience. But of course, there's ways to learn, there's ways to listen, and there's times like Nee was describing where I've also found myself like being, I don't know, like the only trans person in the room or whatever, or one of just a handful of trans people at my undergrad when there was a rally held for trans rights against some new terrible law. I don't even remember which one at this point that was coming down. And like, for whatever reason, there was this expectation that I had something to say. And I remember in that particular moment when there was a big rally going on in front of like the administration building, I was in my dorm room, like zoning out because I was just so tired that I like did not have the spoons to go and interface with something where my like very existence was the thing up for debate. And so it's both and. It's this, we like holding awareness for, I as a white person don't have the lived experience of being Black in America. So if a Black friend of mine is speaking up about that and I start trying to explain to them like how I see it, or like maybe it wasn't about race, maybe that's not why you got fired from this job or whatever. It's like, ooh, maybe like I don't know what that experience feels like. And then also, like, I feel like there shouldn't be necessarily this onus on, sort of like Nee said, the blank kid in the room to always be that voice, to always be the one to step forward and speak on it. And so that, I guess that's just where it gets tricky, is that middle ground of, if I'm the only trans person in the room, but I don't have the spoons to engage on a debate, I need people who are informed and respectful to do that talking on that issue. But not people who are going to claim that they know more than me or that they know firsthand. And I guess that feels like a really important distinction. Yeah.
So I'll share a story that comes at this from maybe a different angle. When I was in college, I spent one summer in Atlanta, and it was a group of college students from our church in Berkeley, California, who spent the summer living in Atlanta, working with kids from different housing projects around the city. And everyone on staff of the organization was white or Black, and our entire group of college students from around the country were white, except for me. And of course, you cannot go to the South and miss that there's some racial stuff going on. And part of our summer, we're engaging in these, I think, sessions that the staff was trying to educate us college students. And my experience living there this summer, so all the kids I was working with were Black, and the other staff camp counselors were white except for me. And the kids, I think I was probably one of the first, if only, Asian people they had really interacted with, and so they were very curious about me. It was clear by the way they treated me that they knew I was somewhat different than the rest of the camp counselors because I was not white. And so the whole discussions this summer, which were tense, we were from California, and we admittedly did not understand the Southern landscape. It's not that we didn't deal with racial issues, but it's just different in the South. And there was this kind of heated one-day discussion months into this summer, and I'd been listening, and I finally dared kind of raise, and I was fairly timid about voicing what I was thinking. And I finally got the courage to say, well, I hear you talking about this, and you keep talking about it in Black and white terms. And I'm just wondering, I'm not Black and I'm not white, and I'm trying to figure out how to navigate this. And one of the Black staff members very quickly stood up and said, look, you just need to understand the landscape here, and you're basically white, and so you need to get in back of the line. And I was very clearly at the moment, I'm like, I know he was shutting me down, and I didn't say anything after that because I didn't know what to say, honestly. And I still go back to that moment and think about how complicated it was and is. And I really didn't have anything to say then. Other people did. All the men, frankly, had something to say, Black and white. And I didn't say anything. I just was like kind of shell-shocked and didn't know what to do with myself. It was clear to me that he felt like I shouldn't be talking.
I feel like there are some threads like dangling from what Becca shared and then what Erica just shared that are like very interesting about this phrase and idea, like only blank people can talk. And it's part of why it's so complicated, because on the one hand, it is this phrase and this idea means that like, if you're someone who's not, if you're the person who's being asked to fill in the blank, that is a very tiring responsibility. And at the same time, like this phrase can be violent. Like it can be used to force people to not speak, even though they have something that's worth saying. And I also just want to name, because Erica, you said something that like has kind of been percolating in the back of my mind when you mentioned that it was mostly the men who had something to say. And I do think that like, and this goes back to what Becca was talking about with like people who don't necessarily have experience or expertise in an area, like still feeling like they need to talk. I feel like that is very true for men in particular. Like there's something kind of floating in the air that says like, we have to have something to say about everything. And like not knowing an answer or not having an opinion is not okay. So if you don't actually have the knowledge, then like say something foolish or just give your best half-baked idea. Or say something that like is rooted in ignorance and in violence, which like from Erica's story, like can cause someone harm and like shut down a conversation in a way that's not helpful. I don't know. There's a lot buzzing around, but.
Oh, I just like, I feel that, and I wanna resonate with that in the sense that like I was raised basically as a straight white man. Like I was raised in the peak of privilege. And so to have experienced that and to now experience life pretty differently has been very interesting for that, because I really feel like I was raised with the expectation, the internalized expectation, and it's really hard to identify where that comes from, but the expectation that I always have something to say, that you just named me. So much so that one of the hardest things for me to do and learn over the last like several years of my life through college, through graduate school, being a young professional now, is knowing when to just listen and not butt in. And I think that, yes, like this phrase, like only Black people can talk or only Black people can talk in such and such a situation, can be used to silence people. I also think that depending on what people actually have to contribute or don't have to contribute, I find it a helpful reminder sometimes to sit back and just listen. And I guess for me, that comes down to, do I actually have a stake in what's being talked about? And Erica, it sounds like you probably had more of a stake than there was room for, than there was acknowledged in that setting. Like, because I think we do need to have conversations about how people who are not Black and not white fit into a lot of these conversations. But like, for example, going back to CV Vitolo-Haddad, a lot of that explosion of news and outrage in Madison activist circles was happening among people I follow on Facebook and I'm friends with on Facebook. And I just stayed silent, completely silent through the entire thing. But I read every single comment thread because I recognized this is not something that I know enough to speak on, but I'm going to use this as an opportunity to really sit down with all of these comments that are going back and forth and people feeling silenced and people feeling attacked, and try and learn from it. And actually one of the things that kept coming up was, how much space do people who are not Black and not white have to contribute to that conversation? Because a lot of the folks speaking were, you know, from backgrounds that were Latina or Indigenous or South Asian or Southeast Asian. And then it's like, it almost raises this question of like, who's where on the scale, you know, on the scale of being closer to privileged or closer to oppressed. I know where I fall on that one, so I was just like sitting back and listening, but it was really interesting And I wish I could summarize all of the lessons from it, but wow.
Well, I mean, it's, it's complicated because I think, well, people have intersectional identities, and I think about my own biracial children, and their experience, and when they're forced. So like when I first enrolled Emma in school, the Madison, they've since changed it, that they required you choose one race. And, that's a whole nother topic about construct of race. But in any case, I could only choose one. And I was like, well, clearly I'm going to choose Asian because I know that's how everyone will see her. But watching them grow up in Madison and realizing what their own sense of their identity was, and having to basically say, well, of course, white was their father is white as part of their identity, but to kind of have to say, but people will not see you that way. People, and like, why? Like that's, and having to say basically, well, this made up construct is basically real enough that you have to deal with that. And so then, to say who has the authority to speak on what and why and when, and right, all these calculations, and frankly, leading to basically kind of a cancel culture of like, how do we ever actually talk frankly with one another, right? And I don't think we always can. People should just be able to spew whatever they want all the time. But it's gotten to the point where I feel like people are afraid to then say anything, right? And usually the only way that I have learned, I mean, I will tell you that though it was a painful moment, I learned a ton in that moment. And, some of it was painful, and some of it I think was probably pretty valuable in my understanding and learning. But isn't oftentimes a lot of learning painful and embarrassing and uncomfortable, and that we have to risk that? So I struggle with this, the only so-and-so can talk, because if that is the parameter, then I feel like we're really, it's going to be hard for people to actually learn and grow if that's the rule. Of course, there needs to be places where that is, but I feel like it's gotten taken to the point where, maybe it's spread a little too far so that people don't dare say anything about what they really think, except in these really extreme ways. It's like either nothing or very extremely vitriolic and out there.
Right. I heard a radio interview actually last night, and it was from Wisconsin young voters, and they had, so the first time voters in Wisconsin, and there were two women of color in their 20s and one white young man in his 20s. They were all college students, and the young man, who's white, is a Republican and grew up in a conservative area. And the two women, one of whom was from the Ho-Chunk Nation and the other of whom is Latina, they talked about the things that were like most critical to them. And some of it was like feeling threatened and where the threats come from, right? So for example, my family is largely in rural areas, largely conservative areas, conservative religious views, and they often feel threatened by urban, political, secular humanist movements, that their freedom and their way of life is not shared by other people, and that they become invisible, especially in the rural Midwest, that they become invisible to the coasts, right? And so I'm aware of that, and it's like, where does privilege moves, right? In these strange, it's not just like you put it on and it's there forever. Like I know in some spaces I have way more privilege, and in other spaces I am very marginalized, and that's a confusing thing to help people navigate. And so, when young white men say to me they feel silenced in classrooms and they feel silenced in public spaces, I believe them. And I also think that moment of learning to listen and not having to say something, which they've sort of been socialized to believe for their own value and visibility they have to do. That there's a little of both. There's a little bit of that violent, shut up, we don't want to hear from you anymore. Like, I'm tired of hearing your voice, and an invitation to try and let people off the having to say something hook, like listen for a while. I don't know, it's hard. That floating privilege thing is hard.
It is our 5-minute bell.
We always have more to say.
We always do.
Yeah. I had a whole other, I don't know. I'm just gonna do it because it's in my mind. It kind of circles back to something, Ginger, you were saying earlier about like when men sort of talk or make decisions on behalf of women. And it's a question that I sort of have to think about for myself in this sort of conversation. Like, if there is someone who is a woman in the room, like if we're talking about women's experiences, like, yeah, I'm not an expert in that field, so I shouldn't take that mantle. But if there are no women in the room, then the question of who gets to talk now is really, really significant. And it's like, okay, I feel like maybe I can, because I've like tried to do my research. But does that make me like pretentious to assume that like when no women are around, I am now the woman expert? Like, it's a hard line to walk.
It's a very hard line to walk. And it's how I try and have conversations about racism in all white groups, because almost if you don't talk about it, then it just becomes a space that's like completely oblivious to the world around us. But I think there's a key difference between speaking out of empathy with humility about experiences that are not your own and saying, okay, this is what I've heard. This is what I've read. This is how I understand my Black friends, or this is how I understand my gay friends are moving through the world. As opposed to either implicitly or explicitly saying, I have this experience, I'm going to speak on it now. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways to handle it. Privilege moves based on circumstance.
And the worst temptation of all, I've read a lot about it and I've studied a lot about it, so I must know.
Yeah.
Well, on that happy thought, friends, colleagues, I guess this one's going to be a wrap, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Yeah. Thanks.